Good morning, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to express a very warm welcome to webinar Linguistics for English Language Teaching, the integrations of theories, practice, and research in ELTs. My name is Samaporn Prasai.
And my name is Rajabhat Kunrat.
We are humbled to be the master of ceremony of today, and thank you so much for having us. We are delighted to be here. All right, for these webinars, of course, today we have our honor to say that we have a special guest with us. Yes, and now.
Well, before we start the ceremony, please allow us to introduce Professor Dr. Hayo Beinders, teaching English to speakers of other languages, Professor and Director of Research of Anaheim University, the United States of America.
Yes, and right now, upon this time occasions, I would like to invite Associate Professor Dr. Akharapol Maihom, Dean of Faculty of Humanities and Social Science, to deliver an opening remarks. Please welcome to deliver a speech. Welcome.
Sawadee, very good morning from Thailand. Ming Karaba to our Burmese friend. Ni hao to our Chinese classmate. And also here with us, our friend, our colleagues from Iran. I don't know how to greet in your language. He is my colleague and other academic friends from different institutes. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, on behalf of Buriram Rajabhat University, on behalf of my president, Associate Professor Malini Jatopama, she was informed by me a few days ago that we are going to have a professor from America coming to give a very special lecture on very trendy topics. She would like to come to deliver a thankful message to our guest speaker, but unfortunately, she was engaged with other important meetings. So that's why she assigned me to give a thankful message to a guest speaker on her behalf. And also I'm coming here today as the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, and also the Chair of Ph.D. program in ELT. So on behalf of BRU, on behalf of HUSOC faculty, on behalf of Ph.D. in ELT program, and also M.Ed. Master of Education in ELT under the Faculty of Education, who are the co-hosts of this webinar. I would like to sincerely thank you very so much to all of you, to my students, M.Ed. student who is the main host of this webinar, and also my sincere thanks go to PhD student, the first batch from different countries, Myanmar, and China and Thailand. And of course, my heartfelt thanks go to my colleagues, Rope from Iran. Thank you so much for coming to attend this. And also my friend from Cameroon, from Philippines. Thank you so much for your interest in this webinar. And moreover, I would like to express my sincere thanks to our academic partners from different universities around Thailand, including Khon Kaen University, Ubon Ratchathani University, and also from Chulalongkorn University in Chiang Mai, etc. Thank you very so much for your energetic participation in this webinar. Please keep in touch with us. We are going to send you the information whenever we are having the webinar. And last but not least, I would like to express my sincere thanks to our guest speaker today. He is a very busy professor. Not easy to get him with us at this time. I kept talking to Professor, our guest speaker today, for nearly 2 months. And originally, we plan to have this workshop on site at BRU, but because of COVID-19 pandemic, still be in our concern. So that's why we change our plan from on-site workshop to webinar. I talked to our professor that if the situation of this COVID is getting better, we would like to sincerely invite him to give a special lecture on site at BRU campus in Buriram. He said, yes, he's very pleased, but he should be informed in advance in order that he will prepare his plans. So thank you very so much, sir, for your invaluable time coming to give very interesting speech title today. So last but not least, by the end of my talk, I would like to invite all of you here in this session. Please join me in welcoming our guest speaker by giving a big round of applause to our invited guest speakers, Professor Dr. Hayo Beinders. Thank you very so much. And at this time, I would like to declare the webinar officially open. Thank you very so much.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. It's nice to finally see you, even though it's on a computer screen. As you say, we have been communicating for a while, and it's been tricky, but we've made it. We found a time, and I'm glad in a way that we're doing it online, because now we have a very international audience, which of course is absolutely wonderful. Coincidentally, I'm actually in Thailand at the moment, so I'm speaking to you from Bangkok. I'm actually in a hotel room, even though I have a condo in Thailand, but the internet was too bad, so I decided just to stay in a hotel, so I wouldn't have any internet problems this morning. So fingers crossed, all of that will go well. But as the professor said, I work for Anaheim University in the United States. I live in New Zealand, but I'm actually originally from Holland. So we have a very, very international community here this morning, indeed. As you can see behind me, this is where I live. I don't know if any of you have had the pleasure of visiting New Zealand, but you're always welcome. And if you do visit, let me know. It's a beautiful part of the world. And although I have to say I'm pleased to be here at the moment, because it's winter time in New Zealand now, and it's nice and warm here, so I prefer that. Anyway, we have an interesting program today. I've thought a bit about what we would do, and having spoken to you, to the faculty, I've decided to cover today's topics in two parts, if you will. The first part, we're going to talk about the value of doing research, and we're going to talk about kind of, what we need to do to be ready ourselves to be able to carry out research. We're not going to talk about research skills per se, but more about our perceptions, our ideas about research. And then in the second part, I was asked to give you some ideas for possible research topics. I know we have a lot of esteemed researchers, faculty in the room with us today. We also have, of course, some of you are students, MA and Ph.D. students, and you may be thinking about possible research topics. So I decided in the second part to share with you essentially some of my own research, and introduce some areas, some topics that I think are currently considered to be very important, but that still are not receiving as much attention as they should. So hopefully for some of you, you'll be able to get some ideas about what's new and what is exciting in the field of language teaching research. Before we do that, though, I realize it's Sunday morning. I don't know about you, but I have a cup of very strong coffee here to wake me up, because normally at this time on Sunday morning I might still be asleep. So in order to engage our brains, and also just to just to make the session a little bit more interactive, I have a few questions for you that are going to stretch your brain. I realize I'm sitting in front of them, so I'll move out of the way in a moment. And I'm going to put you into, how many people do we have? 34. I'll put you into 7 breakout rooms of about 4 to 5 people. And in your group, I would like you to spend a couple of minutes only to try and find the answer to these questions. And then when I bring you back to the main room, I'm going to ask you how many of these answers you were able to find. And then the group that gets the highest number will be the winning group. There are no prizes, but you will have my eternal admiration if you get the highest number of answers correct. So I'm going to move out of the way. I suggest that you perhaps take a photo of the screen. I'm just going to move this out of the way a little bit. Give me 1 second here. And maybe take a screenshot or a photo, because when I put you into the breakout room, the questions may not remain visible to you. Now, you're not allowed to use Google, or for our Chinese friends, you're not allowed to use Baidu. You have to try and find these answers yourself. So I hope you've all been able to take a screenshot or a photo. So I'll now put you into a breakout room. I'll just give you a couple of minutes. It won't be too long, but just to get our brains working. 7 breakout rooms. Here we go. You should see a message on your screen asking you to join the breakout room that you've been assigned to. Good luck. For those of you still here in the main room, if you have any questions, if you're not sure how to join the breakout room, just let me know, either by turning on your microphone or by typing a message in the chat window. But you should see an invitation on your screen to join one of the breakout rooms. You just click on that and it will automatically take you to that breakout room. Welcome back, everybody. I think we have everybody back in the main room. Now that your brains are refreshed, could I ask you just to open the chat window and just type in the number of answers that you think you found, with a maximum, of course, of 6. There were 6 questions. Can you just type the number of questions that you think you found the answer to? So at the bottom of the screen, you should see a chat option. If you click on that. Ooh, typing the answers as well. That's well done. If you threw a grey rock into the sea, what would it become? Yes, you're absolutely right. I can't see your name, but definitely it just stays a grey rock. It's very good. Can you think of a 6-letter word that contains none of these 5 written vowels? Kay says they got 3. And then we've got number 1, rock. Yes, it just stays a rock. Nothing changes about that. It becomes wet. That's right. Absolutely. Rhythm. Very good. Very good, Sue. Excellent, Azza. Well done. Wow. Flybys. I like it. It's actually with a U. F-L-Y-B-U-Y-S, I think. Flyers. No, that's got an E in it. Nice try, though. How about question number 3? Did anybody get the answer to question number 3? What can travel around the world but always stays in one corner? Zoom. No, it doesn't stay in one corner. It takes up your whole screen. I guess maybe your computer screen is a corner, but no, not Zoom. It's a good guess, though. A stamp. Well done. Well done. Exactly. A stamp stays in one corner. All right, here's the fun one. Number 4. I sometimes use this with my friends, and I make a bet with them, and I make a lot of money. Number 4. What is the answer to question number 4? Yes, excellent. Wow, you're good. I hope you didn't use Google, but that's exactly right. Number 4 is the person wrote down on a piece of paper your exact weight. He wrote down the words, your exact weight. Do you get it? He didn't write down a number. He didn't write down a number of kilos. He just wrote down those words. Excellent. Number 5. 9 crows sat on a branch of a tree. A farmer shot 2 of them. How many remained? Any answers? Anyone? You're doing really well so far.
Actually, for me, I cannot see the question.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I realized it's a little bit cut off, but so I'm reading it out to you now. 9 crows, 9 birds, sat on the branch of a tree. A farmer came and shot 2 of them dead. How many crows, how many birds remained?
7.
7.
No?
9. I guess 2 remained, 7 flew away, and 7...
Right. That's
0. Exactly. I think it was Reza. I think the name has disappeared. But exactly. Whoever said none. Exactly. Lolita. Yes, you're right. Of course. What do you think happens when you hear a loud noise? These birds are going to fly away, right? 0 left. Exactly. You got to use your brain. You got to use your brain. I know it's Sunday morning. All right. Last one. What is this phrase? Let me just get out of the way again. You can't see that now because of the chair. So no, that's too difficult. But it basically says the word stand and then a line, and underneath it says the word I. So stand and then a line and then the word I, as in I. Stand, line, I.
understand. I understand.
Very good. I understand. I can see why you are such a famous university, because you're obviously all very clever and also widely awake now. So well done. Well done. Thank you for sharing that. All right, let us go into the topic. And as I said in the first part, I want to talk a little bit about our reasons for doing research. And it's something that I work with a lot of teachers from basically every part of the world. And not all of us have the time to create opportunities to do research, especially when we're busy with our other work, especially when we're busy teaching. Not all of us are, of course, at the moment enrolled in a Ph.D. program, for example, where it's our primary job to do research. But it's still important that we continue into the future to improve ourselves and to conduct research. And so a lot of teachers come to me at workshops, at conferences, and they say, look, I'd like to do research, but it's too hard. I just don't have the time, or I don't really have the skills. And here's an interesting finding from actually a number of studies over a very long period of time that make one thing very, very clear. Teachers who are successful, so we're not talking about researchers, we're not talking about people who do research for their living, but teachers who do find the opportunity to engage in research are actually a lot more successful in many ways. Firstly, they are much less likely to burn out. Okay, meaning they're much less likely to be stressed, and this is a really, really big problem in education in general, and in language teaching as well. There is a very, very high rate of what is called attrition, and attrition just means people leaving the job, just saying, you know what, I've had enough, it's too much stress, too much work, too little pay, I'm going to go and do something else. All right, and this is a huge problem, and it's only going to get worse in the years to come, because this rate of attrition, people leaving, has been increasing. And of course, things like COVID don't help, because they add a lot of stress. However, research that has investigated what makes teachers who don't leave, what makes teachers who stay in the profession different from teachers who do leave, is, well, it's a number of things, but one very important indicator is whether they report doing research. So there's something about doing research that keeps you interested, that keeps you excited, that keeps you motivated to keep going. It also means that you're more likely to report that you are more satisfied being a teacher and being in your job. So there's a personal reason for wanting to do research, because you're more likely to be happy in your job. Well, that's a good reason. There's another reason, and that is that teachers who report doing research are consistently, throughout multiple studies in different countries, in different contexts, whether it's primary, secondary, or tertiary education, are found to be better at their jobs. They have better learning outcomes. Their students do better than the students of teachers who don't do research. And maybe it's something about the enthusiasm that the teachers themselves have as a result of the research. Maybe it's because they develop more knowledge. Maybe it's because they are more reflective. They're better able to think about their own teaching. But the point of the matter is, doing research is good for you. So I'm going to ask you a question. You don't need to answer it here, but I do hope that you kind of take this away and ponder it, consider it. If you did not have to publish, if you did not have to do research, would you still do it? Right now, if you're doing a PhD at the moment, okay, you have to do it. That's fine. That's clear, right? Some of us are teachers, and some of us have to do research, and some of us are required to publish our research in journal articles, etc. Okay. Many jobs require it for promotion. Many jobs require it, as a part of your employment. But if you didn't have to, if for some reason somebody came and said, you know what, forget about it, you decide, you choose, would you still do research? And the big question is, why? What would be your reasons for doing research? What would be your interest in doing research? Well, and some people say, so that I can, become famous, or I can get my name out there, so people can, see my work and, see how good I am and what have you. But here's an interesting fact for you to remember, which you may or may not be aware of. But almost all of the publications of the research in our field, in the arts and humanities, is never, ever cited. The vast majority, 98% of all the publications out there in our field, are never cited. They may be read a little bit, but if they're never cited, they probably haven't been read very much either. In other words, doing research to get your name out there, doing research to make yourself well known in the field, may not be good enough of a reason. So I'm going to ask you another question. In any of your own research projects, past, present, or future, the thing that you need to be clear on, and that I always talk to my students about before they even start on their doctoral program or their master's thesis, is whatever topic you choose, you have to be clear why it's important. And I ask two questions. I say to my students, they come to me and say, I'd like to investigate, corrective feedback, or I'd like to investigate, vocabulary acquisition in online environments, whatever. My first two questions are, who cares? And so what? What's the problem here? What's the real life concern, the issue? In other words, another way of asking, what is the value of engaging in this type of research? We have so much research that doesn't actually add a lot of value. And I think especially in our discipline, in the social sciences and humanities, etc., that is important. And there's a lot of concern at the moment in wider society, in the general press, and in public literature, about the often superfluous nature, superficial nature of current research. And that's a reasonable concern, because a lot of our research, of course, is paid for one way or another, often indirectly, by taxpayers, by society at large. And people want to know what they're getting back for that. And so it's important to remember this before we even start talking about possible research topics today, is that we don't actually need more research. There's so much being published at the moment. There's so much research going on. What we do need, however, is a lot more research that is based on your values, that is value-driven research that tries to bring something to our society. I want to share with you very briefly my personal experience as the editor of a journal. For the last 15 years, I've been the editor, and I started the journal back in 2007, called Innovation in Language Learning and Teaching. And it's a SSCI journal, it's a Q1 journal, it's a widely known and reputable journal. And I started it 15 years ago, and specifically wanted to give it this title, Innovation in Language Learning and Teaching. And that was not just a fancy word, innovation. I really wanted to investigate, what are people doing to change our field? What are they doing to innovate, to actually make a significant contribution to our field? And of all the papers that I receive as the editor, they always come to me first, and then I have to decide, do I send this out for a review, or do I reject this outright? We call that a desk rejection. And I would say that probably about 70%, maybe more, of all the papers that I receive, I desk reject straight away, right? They don't even go out for review. And it's not, and I want to emphasize it because this is kind of the key point of this first section of the workshop, the webinar today. The point is not that they are bad. It's not that they are technically poor. It's not that they are, poorly designed, or that mechanically speaking, the research is faulty. It's just that I can't answer, just to go back to this slide, I can't answer the question when I read it, what the point is. Who cares? So what? And if that is not clear to me as an editor, it's not going to be clear to a potential reader as well. So values are at the heart of everything we do as teachers, and it also has to be at the heart of what you do when you do research. Now, if we were doing this workshop at Buriram, and I hope maybe one day we will be able to do something like this, I would probably put you into groups and get you to think about the key question, which is, what are your values as a teacher and as a researcher, as an academic? We're not going to do that here at the moment because we have a different purpose to the workshop, but these are really fundamental questions that we just don't take enough time for to think about. So if you think about your, who you are as a, as a professional, all right? Let me not even use the word teacher or academic, but you are a professional person. You try to do the best you can. I know that, right? You have ideas about what you can contribute to your students, to your school, to your community, to the parents, whoever it is that you're working with and whoever you're working for. I mean, sure, you need a salary, you need to pay the bills, but you also have become a teacher, an academic, a researcher for a whole range of other reasons. And it's those values that, in my view, need to be reflected in your research. If you just do research to tick a box, it's clear from reading your research that that is what you've done. But if your research reports something that is of meaning and value to your community, then it becomes a lot more interesting and a lot more valuable. See this word? Valuable, values, valuable. So the two questions, second and the third on the page behind me, are, maybe not now, but at some point when you, maybe on the weekend or whenever you're sitting by a beautiful river or something like that, ask yourself, what do you want to do in the next few years? What are your aspirations? Not the next year, that's too short. All right, so slightly longer, not 20 years, that's too long. You want it to be long enough to be a meaningful chunk of time. You want it to be longer than your PhD program, for example, if you're in the PhD program. But you don't want it to be so long that it becomes some distant future. What do you want to do? What are your aspirations? What are your hopes and dreams for the next 5 years? And now here's the key question around research. What role can research play to help you to achieve those goals? So not thinking of research as, teaching and research, or administration and research as something separate, as something that you have to kind of find extra time for at the end of the day, at the end of the week. But no, making it an integral part of who you are and want to be as a professional. How can research help you? How will you integrate it into your life? How will you make research part of your life so it becomes sustainable, so that it becomes part of your practice and it doesn't become something that you have to do on top of everything else, after you've finished your marking, after you've designed your lessons, after you've taught your classes, because then it always becomes something you end up doing on the weekends, at night, and it takes time away from your family, it takes time away from the things that you care about. So integration is the key. So I'm going to, again, and I'll share with you this presentation, by the way, so you can look through these questions whenever you feel sort of in the right mood. But these are kind of fundamental questions. As a person, as a professional, who do you work for? I'm not talking about your institution. I'm not talking about who pays your salary, but who do you want to help? And I'm talking specifically now also about your research. Who do you want to help with your research? Is it teachers? Is it other teachers? Do you want to help them to find better ways to help students? Do you want to help learners directly? Do you want to perhaps show them how they can learn more efficiently or more effectively? Do you want to help other researchers? Do you want to develop theories and advance the field? Maybe you want to help parents or the wider community, society. Maybe you want to help administrators, policymakers. It doesn't matter. None of these is better or worse than any of the others, but it is important to be clear who you are working for. And the second question related to that, and this is one that we don't ask enough, is what is it that you want to do? Do you want to entertain? And there's nothing wrong with that, by the way. Do you want to make people feel better, feel good? Do you want to focus on, I don't know, well-being and motivation and so on? Do you want to inform? Do you want to share things that you have observed? Or do you want to prescribe? Do you want to say, no, this is the way this should be done. I've done my research. I've compared this and this. This doesn't work. This does work. This is what we should do, Or do you want to prevent? Do you want to stop people from making the same mistakes as you've made, right? And then the third question, so these all hang together, is, well, what sort of research and what sort of output, what sort of product will give you the best chance of doing that? So let me give you an example. Let's say that you are interested in classroom-based research. Let's say that you're interested in teaching methodologies. Let's say that you are particularly interested in, I don't know, investigating, I'm just making something up here, the best way to engage in hybrid learning. Okay, hybrid learning, of course, now is a topic of huge importance. As a result of the pandemic, we've all had to develop our online teaching skills, but now, of course, we're slowly starting to get into a situation where it's not uncommon to have some students in your class face-to-face and some students zooming in or whatever online. So that's what we refer to as a hybrid situation. And hybrid teaching is one of the hardest forms of teaching because you have to manage the face-to-face classroom as usual, you have to manage the online classroom, and you also somehow have to bring these two together. So you're basically managing 3 classes at the same time. So hybrid teaching is hard. Now, if you, perhaps with some colleagues, have done some research into how to best engage in hybrid learning, maybe you've investigated how to best support students, maybe you've investigated what sort of skills teachers need to be able to be ready for hybrid teaching, and let's say that you have found some good practices that seem to work quite well, that you want to share with the wider teaching profession in Thailand. Let's say that you want to let other teachers in Thailand know about your research. Well, then what you want to do, looking at question number 2, is you want to inform them about your findings. You may also want to prevent them from making some of the same mistakes that you initially made. How are you going to do that? What is the best way of sharing your research findings? Well, sure, you can put your research into an academic journal article, but remember that statistic I showed you earlier? 98% of all publications in the social sciences are never cited. And also, how many busy teachers do you think read an academic journal article on hybrid teaching? 0. Well, maybe not 0, but very few. Very few of us have the time to do that. So instead, you can think about other ways of sharing your work. Maybe you go to a teacher's meeting. Maybe you go to your local schools. Maybe you write a short piece for a newsletter. Maybe, I don't know, whatever. Basically, the question is, where do your teachers, the people who you're doing your research for, where do they come together? Where do they look for information? That's where you go. And that's how you present your research, not the other way around. Teachers are not going to come to your academic journal article, right? So it all goes back to this issue of values. Now, to finish this section off, and again, we're not going to do this today, but it's a really powerful activity, and I just wanted to share it with you. I'll talk you through it in a minute. And again, this is on your PowerPoint that I'm going to give to you later, and it's maybe an activity that you could do with your colleagues or with your students. And it's an activity that somebody called Tobias Lundgren and his colleagues, he's actually a psychologist from, is it Sweden or Norway, somewhere in Scandinavia, came up with, and essentially asks one simple question: who do you want to be in 5 years, and how are you going to get there? So it's asking you to just step back and reflect on your professional journey, right? What do you want to achieve? And of course, the related question, how does sharing your work help you with this? Now, here's the activity. And again, we're not going to do it now, but maybe one day, if you feel like it, do it with a few colleagues or even by yourself. It's very simple. It's called the bullseye activity. You know, bullseye, like when you're throwing darts, sometimes you see them in a cafe and you're trying to hit the circle right in the middle, and that's called the bull's eye. Okay, so the closer you are to the middle, the better. The further away you are, the less good it is. And what Tobias Lundgren and his colleagues came up with is this circle, which is actually divided, if you look closely, into 4 parts. You can see at the top left-hand corner there's work and education. In the top right-hand corner there's leisure, entertainment, your relaxation time. At the bottom left there is personal growth, your personal development and your health. And at the bottom right there is relationships. So, all the relationships in your life. And the activity is simply to take some time, maybe 10-15 minutes, and think about how closely you are living your life at the moment in accordance with your values for each of these 4 aspects of your life. So for example, you might say, okay, well, in work and education, I'm doing my Ph.D. at the moment. I'm spending 10 hours a day on it. I'm really learning a lot. I'm doing great. And I'm very happy with the way things are going. So you might put your arrow quite close to the center, quite close to the bullseye. But when you look at maybe leisure, your relaxation time, you might say, well, actually, I don't have any relaxation time because I'm spending all my time doing my PhD and my research. So actually, no, I'm not really doing very well there. Relationships, well, maybe you don't even have time to look after your family as much as you would like, or romantic relationships, whatever it may be. So again, maybe you are not so close to the center. So the point is to end up with a picture that allows you to see in one glance how closely across your whole life, not just in science, not just in academia, how closely you are living to your values. And of course, the next step is to do something about that, and to plan your life for the next few years in such a way that you bring your activities across your whole life more closely together. And so the notion of values, personal, research, academic, relationships, is fundamental to us doing well as human beings. And of course, our academic lives are part of our lives in general. The final 2 questions I want to share with you, again, not to do here now, but helpful ones. Firstly is an interesting exercise. Think of someone that you admire professionally, all right? So we're not talking about at the personal level. So actually picture someone. Think of an actual person, not an abstract person. What do they do? What behaviors do they engage in that you could try and emulate or copy, and that you could reflect in your own work, right? So not kind of what magic skills do they have, what amazing abilities that they have that you might not have or might not be able to develop, but what do they do on a daily basis? How do they live their lives? And when I do this activity with teachers, it's often one thing becomes very clear. People, of course, come up with different answers and different examples of people that they admire, but one thing that all of these people tend to have in common, and it doesn't matter if you're from Iran or Thailand or New Zealand, is that those people that we admire professionally act on the basis of their values. And they act on the basis of their values in a consistent manner. It's not like they do one thing today and then something completely different tomorrow. You can rely on them, you can trust them, and you can know what their values are. Those are the people that we admire. Well, it's not a bad thing to ask yourself how you can be a little bit more like that, including through your research. Okay. Related to this, and this will be the final part, specific to thinking about your research journey, is to think about a time when you maybe read a piece of research or went to a conference presentation, or maybe found some scientific information on a website or watched a TED talk, or it doesn't matter. Think of a time when you consumed, shall we say, some type of research and you really felt that it had an impact on you. It was really exciting, or maybe it really even motivated you, maybe it even touched you in some way, but there was something about that about that piece of research that really connected with you. Okay? And we all occasionally come across these articles or presentations or what have you. Well, those are really, really valuable learning opportunities for each of us, especially if you're a student. What is it about that research that connected with you? I'm not talking about the topic per se. I'm talking about the type of research, the way it was presented, the way it was, it tried to make an impact. In other words, the value that it had to you. And when you can identify that value, well, now you have an opportunity to try and do something similar yourself in your own research. You can try and copy that type of research and develop your own skills around that. So it's good to talk about research methodologies, and it's good to talk about research techniques and different methods and all that. And clearly those are vital. Those are absolutely fundamental building blocks of doing good research. But doing good research and doing valuable research are two completely different things. And I hope that you remember that they are both important. Just for the purposes of our students in particular, just a couple of slides I want to share with you, just based on my own experience supervising students over the last 25 years. I've supervised many dozens of PhD students to completion or examined their dissertations. One thing that comes up again and again is that it's so hard to even just get started. It's so hard you feel like you are, you're just beginning, and then you read these articles by famous people and they seem to know so much, and they are so good at, bringing all the knowledge together, and sometimes it may even be completely demotivating. How do you even start to do that kind of research? And the advice is very simple. Read as much as you can and write as much as you can. And here's a piece of advice from a colleague of mine, Denise Brown. She says, don't overthink it. Just do it. Research, essentially, at the end of the day, is just doing stuff. It's essentially just doing reading and doing writing. And like any skill in life, you cannot develop a complex skill without doing it. You cannot just think. It's like driving a car. You can not learn how to drive a car by just thinking about it, or by just reading a manual about how to drive a car. It's a little bit useful to do that, but at some point you have to just get behind the wheel, right? And it's the same with your research. Don't worry, just jump in. And Denise Brown, as I said, my colleague, has this activity. It only takes 30 minutes, even if you're not at the stage of writing up your research or whatever. Just to make it a practice, you allocate 30 minutes every day to just write. And she says, be very specific. Who are you writing for? Think about some actual people in your life. And they could be people that you know personally. It could be a famous researcher. It could be a colleague. It doesn't matter. But think about some specific people. Write about what you did, why you did it, write what happened, what does it mean in theory, what does it mean in practice, and what is the benefit for the readers, what remains unsolved. If you add up the number of words here, it's about 250 words, which on a piece of paper or on a computer screen is only like a long paragraph. It's really short. So we can do this. We can do this. And here's another one. And this is when you don't even, again, just to practice, just to get into the habit. This is from Denise Murray. This work needs to be done because, you see, it starts off, again, right away with the values. It doesn't say, the theory, blah, blah, all of that is important, but no, it starts with the value. This work needs to be done because those who will benefit from this include. So start from that, and that needs to be up front and center first before you can move on to the rest. What I did was, how I did it was, what happened was, etc. You can see just 25 words. That's essentially one sentence or two sentences for each. And you practice this as often as you can. And you get better and better at it, and you start to develop this confidence of sharing your message. All right, I'm going to skip a few slides because we don't need this. But what I do want to tell you before we take a quick 5-minute break and get on to some actual possible research topics that I want to share with you is the PowerPoint. As you can see behind me, there's a link, and I'll type it into the chat window in a moment as well. But my website is innovationinteaching.org. And you can read all my articles and all the stuff that I will talk about in the second part of today's webinar. You'll be able to download there. But if you add the /Buriram.php, it will take you straight to a handout that I've created for you, an electronic handout. And on the handout, you'll find a link. You'll be able to download the PowerPoint for the first part, as well as also later the PowerPoint for the second part. So again, innovationinteaching.org. If you want to go to the site and just add the /Buriram.php for the digital handout. So everything I've shared with you just now is on there. And I do encourage you to find the time, maybe with a friend or a colleague who you trust, to have a nice cup of coffee, maybe sometime after work, whatever, and just bring these questions with you and just have that conversation. Because being clear about your values honestly is going to be one of the best antidotes to burning out, and is going to help you to see the point and experience the joy of doing research a lot more. And so I can't stress the importance of that enough. All right, it's 9:56. We'll just take a very brief break. Maybe we'll come back at 5 minutes past 10, so in just under 10 minutes. So go and have a cup of coffee if you like, and then we'll move on to the second part. So we'll see you very soon.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much.
So right now it's break time. We will come back to the session 2 in 10:10. So let's have a break.
Okay, 10:10. Okay, 10 minutes past 10. Thank you.
So welcome back again to the webinar by Professor Dr. Hayo Riders. So hope everybody will come back and ready to take the session 2. So we would like to invite Dr. Hayo to take over for this session. So please.
Thank you. Your colleague just said 10 minutes past 10, so I'm worried that some people might still be out having their coffee. I have it 5 minutes past 10 now.
Oh,
Maybe we just-
okay. So maybe because of the mistake in the time calculation. So please apology in my mistake.
No problem at all. So I'll just give it another couple of minutes maybe, and then we'll start again if that's all right. Welcome back, everybody. I know that we're still a couple of minutes short of 10 past 10, but maybe I can just open it up for a couple of minutes to some questions. After the next part, we'll have plenty of time for some conversation and some Q&A. But are there any questions or comments about the things we talked about in the first part? You can type your question in the chat window if you prefer, or you can turn on your microphone and ask your question that way. If I could get all of you to open your chat window anyway, because for the next part, I'm going to ask you to perhaps occasionally type in something in the chat window, so you might as well have it ready and open as we start with the second part of the webinar. So I have it almost 10 past 10 now, so hopefully everybody is back or on their way back. Hopefully we haven't lost anybody in cyberspace. So as I promised in the beginning, what I want to do in the second half of the webinar is share with you some of my own research, share with you some topics that I think are topical, meaning that they are receiving a lot of attention, but also topics that have a lot of unresolved questions and therefore are very, very good areas for considering when doing your own research, because there's a lot of valuable investigation to be done in this space. And I'm going to share with you some ideas, some theories that I've developed over the years, as well as some examples of research projects. And most of them, what they have in common is that they are all in some way or other related to researching language learning beyond the classroom. That doesn't mean that they don't involve teachers. It doesn't mean that they don't involve the classroom at all. It just means that the primary area of research is outside of the classroom. And it could be that there is a connection from what happens outside the classroom with what happens inside the classroom. So we're not ignoring the classroom in this research, but the primary interest is in what happens outside the classroom. Now, as we go along throughout the presentation, I am going to ask some questions, not to you specifically to answer, but more I would say potential unresolved areas for future investigation, let's call it that. And whenever you hear me say something like that, or even when you don't hear me explicitly ask a question like that, but when you are listening to the topics, whenever you think, hey, that could be a potential research question, or even if not a specific question, at least an area of research, a research topic, type the word Q, the letter Q for question, in the chat window. And the aim for the rest of this webinar is for all of you to collect as many Qs, as many questions as you can, because the more questions that you identify, the more potential areas for research, hopefully ideas for research, you can come up with afterwards yourself. So I'll repeat the instructions. It's very simple. As you are listening, if you hear me talk about a topic or even explicitly ask a question that you think is worthy of investigation, type the letter Q in your chat window, just as a reminder for yourself that, hey, this is something that might be worth exploring further in my own research. All right, let us jump straight into this, and let's go straight for the jugular. We hear a lot about this word change. In fact, we hear about it every day, don't we? Especially, of course, in the last 2 years, even before that, in education has to change. Education has to be fundamentally revised. And especially with, the move to online teaching, of course, a lot of us have experienced change. But, and this is a key distinction I want to spend a little bit of time on, a change is not the same as an innovation. All right, and we have to separate these out into two separate domains, especially when it comes to our research. I mentioned to you I edited a journal called Innovation in Language Learning and Teaching, and it was especially to investigate this difference. So let's stop for a second. What is an innovation? Well, an innovation in a language teaching program, and it could be, self-study program, or could be a classroom-based program, doesn't matter, any kind of language, really, language development, is first and foremost an informed change. So make a note of that. An innovation is not just any change. An innovation is an informed change. What is an informed change? Well, an informed change is one where people who are affected by the change have had a chance to think about it. They've had a chance to reflect on it. They've had a chance to discuss it and maybe make decisions about how to respond to the change. In other words, there's a lot of changes in our lives, but there's not as many innovations. So a possible area of research, and I'm going to give this one to you explicitly, is how do teachers identify and make informed decisions about the changes that affect them? How do teachers do that? How do teachers know when things are changing? And how do they find the opportunity to reflect on it in order to make an informed decision? Do they do that alone? Do they do that together? Do they do that as a result of their managers telling them? Do they do that as part of their everyday practice? We're talking about the field of teacher reflective practice, and of course also teacher professional learning, teacher professional development. So the question again, how do teachers respond to change? How do they identify change, and how do they come to an informed decision about that change? Well, I don't see anybody typing a Q in the chat window yet, but I think you've missed an opportunity. Yeah, well done. 10 points for you, Yawalak. Well done. This is an important area of research. We don't really know. We don't really know how teachers move from change to innovation. We don't know how that happens. In many cases, we know it doesn't happen, but we don't know why. All right, the second characteristic of an innovation is that it's not just any old change. It's not changing the color of the carpet in your classroom. That's a change, but it's not an innovation. So what is an innovation? Well, an innovation is a change in an underlying philosophy of language teaching and learning. We've talked a lot about, values, right? Well, philosophy and values are related to each other. So if something changes fundamentally about how we think of language learning and teaching, something shifts in what we see, how language learning and teaching can and should take place, then we're talking about an innovation. So just moving your classroom from, say, a physical environment to an online Zoom class is a change. But unless there's something that dramatically shifts in the way that you support your learners, there is no innovation in the teaching, because you're basically doing the same thing online as you were doing in a face-to-face classroom. So here's another interesting question. When you look around, whether it's in your school, whether it's in your university, whether it's in your country, or whether it's even worldwide, how many of the changes that we experience in education are actually innovations? How many would you actually classify as an innovation? What makes a change in a particular classroom, a particular school, an innovation? What are the characteristics of that? Here's another big cue for you. How do we know how many changes actually result in true innovation? So another possible area of investigation. All right, so change and innovation. Why do I start by talking about this? Because what I want to get to is this area of language learning beyond the classroom, which is an area of significant potential innovation. And the reason why it's innovative is that, and we have to go back a little bit here, throughout most of history in formal education, including language education, what we have offered our learners is support with formal learning. All right, so this is the kind of teaching and instruction that we're all familiar with. It's in a classroom, there's a teacher at the front, the learners are sitting facing the teacher, and that type of learning is important, and it has a number of significant benefits. It's very easy to plan, it's very easy to structure, it's very easy to monitor and control. In most of traditional language instruction, you know who your learners are, you know who's going to be in your class next Monday, you know what time the class starts, and you know that at 9:15 you're going to start teaching grammar, and at 9:45 you're going to do vocabulary, and at the end of the semester you're going to give them a test, and everything is very easy to organize. And it can be very efficient, because basically we are largely giving all of the learners the same content at the same time in the same way. So there are certainly benefits to this type of model. It actually originates in India in the 19th century, when the British were occupying large parts of the country, and where they quickly needed to establish a bureaucracy to help manage this huge country with only a very small number, relatively speaking, of British people there. And so they had to train, and I use the word train explicitly, they had to train local people to be able to carry out daily administration, taxes, supplying water, all these kinds of things. So basically the content was very fixed and very clear, and it was the same for everyone. So it made sense to teach all these tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Indian people the same content in the same way. And that's kind of the model that we are still working with now. So what I want to introduce to you next, and this is where you might identify some possible research questions, or research topics at least, is the notion of learning spaces. Learning spaces are far more interesting than just a classroom. A learning space is an environment, any environment, that has the potential to support language learning. I'll repeat that. A learning space is any environment that has the potential to support language learning. One learning space is the classroom, where we instruct learners through formal instruction. The language classroom has potential to support language learning, luckily. But it's certainly not the only learning space that is out there. And I want to share with you some of the other types of learning spaces that exist. I'm not going to go through all of these. Again, you'll have the PowerPoint later, and I'm also giving you lots of references on the handout to things that I've written in the past about this topic, etc. So we're not going to go through this exhaustively, but I do want to give you some examples. The first learning space is remote learning. And if you compare traditional learning, formal learning, with remote learning, you will notice that in many cases, the only difference is the physical location of the instruction and the learning. So we're taking a physical classroom with the four walls and we're basically moving it into a virtual space, but beyond that, nothing usually changes. So the location changes of the learning space, but the philosophy and the pedagogy often don't. Well, here's an interesting research question. Is what I said true? What are the features, what are the characteristics of remote learning as it happens in a particular school as done by a particular teacher? How does a teacher who is not like an extremely experienced expert in online education, but just, like shall we say a normal average teacher who has to move some of their classes online, how do they do that? What characteristics does an online remote learning environment have in that case? Is it mostly a copy of what happens in the physical classroom, or are there things about that space that the teacher uses that are different? There's an interesting cue for you. There's an interesting area of research. We don't know. I know from my own observations, and so I'm reasonably confident to predict that the physical and the remote environments or spaces are very similar, but it would be great if a PhD student could actually investigate that. Let's look at a space that is more different. Flexible learning. So flexible learning is learning that takes place in an environment where the timing, so the key word here is timing, where the timing is determined not by the institution, not by the curriculum, not by the teacher, but by the learner. So here, yes, there is something fundamentally different. There is something philosophically, if you will, different about the learning. Because in flexible learning, the learner, him or herself, has to decide when they have a need for learning and when it is most appropriate and useful for them to receive support. So you can see this is really quite different from a formal classroom environment. And to give you an example from language learning in schools and universities, a self-access center or an independent learning center is an example of a flexible learning space, because learners can decide after class if they want to go there, they can decide when they want to go there, and they also have some flexibility in terms of deciding what they do when they get there. In a work-related environment, in a corporate environment, you will find that most professional learning doesn't take place through formal instruction, but it takes place, for example, when an employee says, hey, I have to use this new project management software or whatever. I don't know how to do it. I need some training and I need it now. And then they contact the professional development team and some training is offered to them. So it's flexible. So here's another question for you. How much of language learning for different types of learners, primary, secondary, tertiary, adult learners, etc., is flexible? How much of what learners receive in these different environments have some sort of flexibility built into it? Okay. Here's another type of learning space, and this is a really interesting one because this is one that most of us probably haven't heard of before, and it's called performance support. And the reason why I show this one is that it's actually the most common way for adults to learn. This is the most common form of learning, not formal learning, not remote learning, not any of these other ones. This one here, performance support, is how adults learn. So what is it? Well, if you look at the image, if you look at the picture, you see a person digging a hole in the road. Okay, maybe they're laying a pipe or an electricity cable or something like that, all right? You can see that there is somebody standing next to them with a laptop. So what's happening here is that the person performing the job, in this case digging a hole, has run into some sort of problem. Maybe they're about to hit a pipe that they shouldn't, or maybe they're not sure where the electricity cable should go. All right, so they're busy performance, their job, and they need help, they need support during that performance. They can't finish the job without performance support. Now, if you think about it, that is how all of us here learn the majority of the time. If you're a language teacher and you need to figure out how to use a new piece of software, or you need to, you've got a new textbook or something like that, something new you need to figure out. You don't immediately go and enroll for, a master's program or a formal course at Buriram Rajabhat University. You just go and watch some YouTube videos. You talk to a colleague. You observe somebody who has more experience. You just go and have a chat with people, right? You just try it out. In other words, you engage in performance support. The last one I want to share with you, and I'll give you an example of a research project in a moment, is game-based learning. Gaming environments, gaming spaces, for those of you who play computer games you will know, but even if you don't, if you've observed people playing computer games, are incredibly rich environments with a lot of opportunity for communication and interaction and sharing, and, well, a lot of potential benefits for language learning exist in these environments. But I'll give you a couple of examples of that in a moment. There's a lot of them that we haven't even touched on. You've got informal learning, for example, listening to music, learning by watching movies, reading a book, peer learning, learning with somebody else at similar to your level, self-learning, community-based learning, mentor-based learning. There are literally dozens, but the most common ones are listed here on this slide, of types of learning spaces that surround us at all times. So here's another interesting research question for you, and this is one that I think is incredibly important and entirely under-researched. What learning spaces do a particular group of learners that you're interested in, it could be your primary school students in Buriram, or it could be university students in Iran, or it could be adult learners in Myanmar, doesn't matter. What learning spaces are available to your research population, to the students that you're interested in? And how much use do your learners make of these different learning spaces? So there's another big cue for the chat room. How do each of these learning spaces contribute to learners' success? So just as a little side note, I have a co-author and a friend from Norway called Pia Sundquist. And Pia Sundquist observed, like many other people in Norway, that a lot of learners who are in school, when they're outside of class, engage in a lot of English language use. They occupy learning spaces outside of the classroom all the time. They watch a lot of English movies, they listen to English music, they play a lot of English language games, they even just talk in English just for fun as part of the youth culture. So there's a lot of opportunities for language learning. And what she and her colleagues wanted to investigate was, well, how much does that contribute to their language learning success? And how much does it contribute compared to the formal instruction that they receive in the classroom? Now, I know Norway and Thailand are very different contexts, okay? So I'm fully aware of that. But still, what was very interesting was that through their research, they found that the majority of students said that the majority of their learning came from what happened outside the classroom. Only a small part, they said, resulted from the formal instruction that they received from their teachers. So that's an interesting question to ponder. What learning spaces do your learners have access to? What contribution do those learning spaces make to the classroom? Why is this so important? Well, this goes to the heart of the values of doing research, doesn't it? 70 to 80% of adult learning takes place outside of formal education. And we repeat that, 70 to 80% takes place outside of formal education. The vast majority. Well, here's an interesting question, and one to which I partly know the answer because I've been investigating it for at least 2 decades, but partly I don't know the answer because not many people are investigating it. How are teachers in formal education and formal instruction, how are they preparing learners for this reality? How are they preparing and supporting learners with their learning outside of the classroom? The answer, insofar as I know from my research, is most teachers don't, or when they do, it's very little. But we need a lot more research, and we need to understand much better what it is that teachers do, what it is that teachers don't do, and why it is that they don't do that. Well, you might say, okay, hold on, let's go one slide further. Yeah, you might say, well, my kids, my students are not adults. They are not, they're in primary school, they're secondary school, so they're not spending all that time learning outside the classroom. To which I would say, well, have a look at this graph here. Even learners who are in compulsory education, some from the ages of 6 to, say, 16, 17, still, of course, spend the majority of their day outside of formal language learning environments, in the home, on the sports field, with friends, with parents, grandparents, etc. So if you look at it across the lifespan, the amount of time learners spend in formal education is actually really, really small. So we need 2 terms. We've had lifelong learning for decades, and I started out my own research career in the area of learner autonomy and learning strategies. And the point about all of these research endeavors and pedagogical practices is to help learners to develop the ability to manage their learning at a time when you are no longer there as a teacher, right? So a learner who graduates from school and goes to high school is you no longer support them, you're no longer there for them. Somebody who goes from high school to university, again, you're no longer there for them. Going from university to the workplace, at some point learners will have to manage their learning throughout their lives by themselves, and we as teachers need to support them. But there is a term missing, and so a few years ago I introduced the notion of life-wide learning. So whereas lifelong learning is chronological, it looks at the whole lifespan, life-wide learning says, well, let's look at all the spaces that learners occupy right now across their lives, and let's make sure that we support learning in all of those spaces as best as we can. And there's a number of interesting research questions around that as well. Now, before I move on and give you a couple of practical examples of research projects, there's two additional points I want to make. One is that the vast majority, and I can't put an exact number on it, but I have tried in the past and looked, for example, at research publications in our field, etc. The vast majority of research in language education investigates classroom learning and classroom learning only. And the reason for that is partly because of history. Just, people, if other people do it, you're more likely to do it as well. And it's partly because investigating what happens in class is easy, relatively speaking. You know when to expect your learners, you know who they are, you can force them to answer your questionnaires, you can, interview them. They're a very captive audience. Whereas if you try to investigate what happens in various learning spaces outside the classroom, things get a lot harder, because you don't know where learners are, you don't know when they're going to be there, you don't know how to approach them, you don't know exactly what they're doing, and so it makes it a lot trickier. But it also makes it incredibly important, because if nobody does it, and if it's such an important part of language learning, and we're not investigating it, we're missing an incredible opportunity, and also we're letting down our students. So again, starting from values, well, who cares? So what? Why is it important? Well, because it's 70 to 80% of our learners' lives. Let's investigate it. So there's a big queue here in the chat room to investigate learning beyond the classroom. And before I move on to some practical examples, in case you're thinking, well, how do we know whether learning outside of formal education is beneficial? How do we know that it has been proven in some way to, theoretically proven to result in or support language development? To which I answer, well, there are decades of research, often in different fields, often in educational psychology and technology and other areas, that have very clearly and unambiguously shown the benefits of learning in these different spaces. And I'll very briefly just pinpoint a couple. I don't want to go into the theory too much, because that would be an entire lecture series on its own. And you have all the references in the PowerPoint. So if you want to look up any of these resources and read them later, you can do so. But I just want to give you a couple of examples. For example, the notion of ubiquitous learning means that, partly because of technology, but not necessarily, learning can and does take place across learners' lives, life-wide learning, in all of these different learning spaces that we've just looked at. And if learning can happen anywhere, anytime, then you can imagine that will have significant benefits for learners, because, well, if I can learn potentially, 16 hours a day when I'm not sleeping, as opposed to 1 hour a day when I'm in my English class, that very much increases the opportunity for my language learning success. Another example are situated and experiential learning, and we have a lot of research showing the importance of these notions in language education and education in general. So situated learning is learning that takes place in an environment, in a situation that has some degree of meaning to the participant, to the learner. And I'll give you an example. Let's say that in class we're practicing how to have a conversation, and we have a role play, etc. But we're just talking about what it says in the textbook, and we're just doing it because I told you to as a teacher. Now, imagine another situation where I'm outside of the classroom and I'm trying to do something, but maybe it could be online, I'm trying to communicate, I'm trying to place an order, I'm trying to type to someone in a chat window, maybe ordering something from Amazon or whatever, and I'm having a problem. I'm communicating with that person. Suddenly, there is a situation that I actually have a personal investment in. I want to order this thing. I can't. I have a problem. I need the support. I need to talk to someone. I need to exchange information. Now, we know from research that what happens in that situation, whatever new word is offered or whatever else occurs, is much more likely to be remembered by me than what happens outside of a situation like that. Because I'm not just remembering the word or the expression or the grammar or the vocabulary, I'm remembering the situation. My brain stores all this kind of information, all these memories about when it was, who I was talking to, how I felt at the time, how they looked if I'm seeing them in person, whether they smiled, whether I was nervous, the environment, what it looked like. All of these kinds of things help us to memorize what happened. And if I experience it at a personal level, it's much more likely to be meaningful to me, and it's much more likely to be stored. So these are just a couple of examples showing that there is a very strong theoretical foundation for the benefits of learning in different learning spaces outside of formal education. But as I said, I'm going to move away from the theory a little bit, but here are some good resources for you to follow up on later. By the way, here's an interesting research question, going back to the previous slide. If you investigate learners, your learners, or even learners who are not in your class, and if you ask a group of learners what learning spaces they occupy, well, you could try, and this will be a very interesting research project, to firstly identify what spaces do they occupy. Secondly, what characteristics do those spaces have? And thirdly, what types of learning do these spaces support? What types of learning do these spaces result in? Is there evidence of ubiquitous learning? Do learners actually show that they tend to learn in different places at different times throughout the week? Are there examples of social learning going on in these spaces? So you could actually map out the different types of learning and their benefits in different spaces over a period of time. Say, observe a group of 5 or 6 or 7 learners for a month or 2 months and ask them to keep a record, like a diary or something like that, or you interview them twice a week or ask them what they did and what have you. Well, here's your theoretical framework. All right, let me give you an example of a research project. This was actually carried out in Thailand quite a few years ago now, maybe 9 years ago. And this is a project using one of the learning spaces, computer games, digital games. And in this particular project, we had some students at Durakit Pandit University here in Bangkok. And my former PhD student, Sorada Watana, and I were observing the students that she was teaching at the time at this program that she was in, and these were all science students. And well, frankly speaking, they had zero interest in learning English, but they had to. And I know this is very common, of course, in Thailand. Especially in the first 2 years, a lot of students have to take compulsory English language classes. So their motivation was very low. They really didn't see the point of learning English. Another problem that we observed, and I've seen this many times in Thailand, also in Myanmar, also in China, by the way, a little bit less so in Iran, but in most countries, is that learners have a very low level of confidence in their English language ability and a high level of anxiety. There's a lot of stress about especially having to speak up in front of other classmates. Students report feeling anxious, feeling that they might, they worry about looking silly, and so on and so forth. And so this was a really big concern to us. Now, what we observed from these science students, computer science, was that they were very, very keen computer game players. Many of them were playing computer games every day after class, sometimes even, secretly in class. And we asked them, what is your favorite game at the moment? And it was an online role-playing game. As I said, this is quite a few years ago, called Ragnarok. I don't know if any of you play computer games here. But Ragnarok was a very popular online role-playing game, an MMORPG. And for those of you who don't play games, a role-playing game is a kind of environment where you log in and you meet other players, and you are an online character, you're an avatar, so you don't show up like with your camera, you show up as one of the characters that you can see on the screen behind me. And as part of our research project, we investigated these students using a pre-test and a post-test, and we investigated things like their level of L2 anxiety, so how much anxiety they reported experiencing in learning English normally, and as well as their level of confidence, their level of motivation, and various other things. And then for the period of one semester, we had our experiment. And here's what we did in the experiment. We told the students that they could play this online role-playing game as much as they wanted as part of the course. And initially they did not believe us. They said, are you sure? We don't have to use the textbook as much, and we don't have to do all those things, but we could just play this game. And we said, yep, you can have fun. But there are going to be 2 rules that you have to stick to. One, when you play Ragnarok, you have to log in to the online Ragnarok international online server, not the server in Thailand. So of course you can imagine the online international server of this game has people from all around the world. And of course the language of communication for all these people is English. Exactly right. So now suddenly, whenever they logged into the game, everything, the interface of the game, all the communication, everything was in English. The second thing we told them is we're going to give you some assignments, some quests. Now, again, for those of you not familiar with digital games, a quest in a game is like a task. It's like an adventure. It's a series of activities, of tasks that you have to carry out. For example, to find a treasure, or to engage in a battle or something like that. And specifically, we gave our participants a number of quests that involved them having to go and chat to other players, exchange information, find out where things were hidden. In other words, we made sure that the quests, the activities were very, very communicative, that they involved a lot of language use. At the end of the semester, in the post-test, we gave these participants the same battery of language tests again, to ascertain their level again of L2 anxiety, L2 confidence, motivation, etc., etc. Well, here is a couple of interesting things that we found. The first was that all of these had gone up or down significantly. Motivation was up, confidence was up, anxiety significantly down. And what we observed was that what these students experienced was a huge and significant, statistically significant increase in WTC. Now, for those of you not familiar with the concept, WTC stands for willingness to communicate. And it's a very helpful, very useful term. It means essentially L2 learners' readiness, or their willingness to engage, to use the target language at a specific moment in time. So, in other words, in a particular situation, am I ready, willing, and able to actually use the target language, English, in this moment, yes or no? Well, this was a construct that had gone up most significantly during that time. We followed it up with interviews to speak to these students and to find out why this willingness to communicate had gone up so much. And there were various reasons. One was that they enjoyed playing the game. They actually wanted to do well. They wanted to communicate because they wanted to win. They wanted to find the treasure, whatever it was. They actually enjoyed that aspect of it. Another aspect was that they were not afraid to use the language and to make mistakes because they were not actually playing the game as themselves. They were playing the game as somebody else, as a computer avatar. In other words, if their avatar made a mistake and looked silly, it didn't matter, right? Because it wasn't really them anyway, right? So this had a really positive impact on them. Now, why am I sharing this project with you? I'm sharing it for two reasons. One, it's an example of learning beyond the classroom, even though it started within the classroom, even though we as the teacher and the researchers initiated the project. So you can see learning beyond the classroom can definitely start from within the classroom, but it opened up a space beyond the classroom that normally would have not been used for language learning practice and language learning. Secondly, I'm sharing it with you because it's an example of the type of research that you can carry out that we need a lot more of, right? We need to figure out what types of spaces, like digital games or whether it's, doesn't matter, what types of activities that learners engage in out of the class, what kinds of benefits those types of spaces and activities have on learners. We also need to figure out how we can support learners better. In this case, things worked out quite well because we didn't just tell them, go and play some games, because they would have just ended up playing the games in Thai and not really communicated very much. But by actually thinking about our framework, our theoretical framework, using tasks, communicative tasks as the pedagogical activity, we actually were able to establish, look, these types of tasks and this type of learning space lead to these types of learning outcomes. Well, that's very powerful because that's something worth sharing with other teachers, materials designers, etc. Right? So hopefully this will give you some ideas for the type of research that you can carry out yourself. Okay. How are we doing for time? 10:51. Okay. So this is where I want to make a very brief deviation into a key aspect of learning beyond the classroom, which is to do with motivation and also with L2 engagement. Because as you can imagine, a lot of the potential benefits of learning beyond the classroom are in some way or other related to the topic of motivation. Learners enjoy engaging in activities that they normally do for fun and that they engage in without a teacher telling them to do so. So if we as teachers can find opportunities to integrate those types of learning into our instruction, that can be very beneficial for motivation. So for that reason, I just want to take a brief step into the world of motivation as it relates to learning beyond the classroom. And I want to share with you this model that some of you may know, but to some of you may be new. And again, you can look up the references later if you want to find out more about it. But in the area of learning beyond the classroom, a very powerful framework, a very powerful theoretical framework that has driven and can continue to drive a lot of research going forward is the self-determination theory of L2 motivation. So for those of you not familiar, it's often referred to as SDT, which stands for self-determination theory. And it was first proposed in the 1980s actually, by Ryan and DC, and further developed over the years. And hundreds, if not thousands, of research studies in all sorts of different areas, domains in education and language education as well, have been drawing on this theoretical framework. So I'll very briefly talk you through it because I find it's very helpful in our line of research. So self-determination theory, essentially, and I'm simplifying it here a little bit, holds that for learners to be motivated, 3 different components have to be in place. And those are autonomy, relatedness, and competence. And I'll briefly explain what they are in a moment. Those three components are universal, meaning that they don't depend on whether the learner is Thai or Dutch or Iranian. They apply universally. They also don't depend on whether the learner is a primary school student or an adult learner or anything in between. So they are universal components of L2 motivation. So let's talk about these three components briefly. Autonomy. I think most of you will be familiar with this term. It's the notion of feeling as a learner that you are in charge, that you have the ability to make some sort of change, to have some sort of control over your learning and over the environment that you are in. Now here's an interesting research question. If you were to investigate a group of learners in a formal language classroom, in a traditional language classroom, how often and how much do you think that most learners feel that they are in charge? That's an interesting research question. I don't think it has been investigated all that well or all that often. I suspect that the answer is not very often and not very much, which is part of the reason why so many language learners, formal language learners, report low levels of motivation. All right, so autonomy is one component. The second is relatedness, and relatedness refers simply to our human desire, our need to feel connected to other people. We need to feel that we have a relationship with others. And again, this will be an interesting research project, but I suspect that the reason why a lot of online language education, a lot of Zoom classes were not as successful or experienced as successful by language learners and teachers, by the way, was because there was often a lack of relatedness. People just feel, isolated. They feel unconnected to those around them. In a physical classroom, that can happen too, and it does happen, and it will be interesting to investigate how much it happens. But it's easier as a teacher to walk around the classroom, to put your hand on somebody's shoulder, to have a chat with someone if they look like they might be feeling a little bit down. You know what I mean? It's easier to maintain that human connection than in an online environment. Well, that would be an interesting research project. Is that true? The third component is competence. All of us, all human beings, need to feel that we are effective, that we're capable, that we're getting better at things, that we are growing. If we don't feel that we are competent, basically if we feel that we are incompetent, if something or someone makes us feel incompetent, our motivation disappears immediately. So these are three very interesting components. Now, when we look at learning beyond the classroom, and I've got the word technology here, it's a leftover from an earlier slide, probably replace technology with learning beyond the classroom, although a lot of learning beyond the classroom is supported by, mediated by technology, so it doesn't really matter. But, an interesting question to ask for any specific environment that you care to investigate. How can this environment, how can this program, how can this technology, how can this learning space, how can this classroom, how can this teacher help to foster, to grow autonomy, competence, and relatedness? And it could be that you investigate one of these, it could be that you investigate two or all three. But these are powerful and important questions. So I want to give you some examples of how we can investigate these and how we can improve not just our research skills but also our pedagogical practices, because I have to find that they go hand in hand. But before we do that, I have it 11 o'clock now. I think it would behoove us to have another short break. So let us grab another cup of coffee if you need one, and come back at 10 minutes past 11, so in just over 10 minutes, and we'll continue with the third and final part. So 10 minutes past 11, we'll see you again.
Welcome back again to the webinar by Dr. Hayo Raiders. So right now is 11 and 10. So we are going to see about the last part or the last session of this webinar. Before we will have Q&A and the closing remark. So Dr. Raiders, taking away.
Microphone
All
is
right,
off.
so please turn on your microphone, please.
Thank you. Right. So before I continue with the third part, any questions about anything we've talked about so far? Don't be shy.
Many questions.
Many questions. Okay. Well, let's take a few minutes. Let's take 5 minutes or so to deal with a few questions, and then we'll do the next part, and then we'll keep a few minutes again at the end for some other questions. So if you want to go ahead, Ajahn Yawalak.
Ajahn Yawalak, you are from Korat, Rajabhat University, right? Ajahn Yawalak. Ajahn Yawalak. Ajahn Yawalak, where are you from?
I mean, I just want to get the answer, you know, by maybe probably searching by myself, because so many things that, you know, actually I don't have any idea for some, I mean, topics. So better to, so don't want, I mean, I don't want the others to just like wasting the time for this. Yeah. So we go for that. Thank you so much for giving me the chance.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And I see you've been posting a lot of cues in the chat window, which is very good, very active of you. Thanks for your participation. I can see a lot of questions. It's good. Actually, maybe what you just said actually is a very nice segue for me to continue with the next topic. So maybe I'll do that, and we'll save up your questions for a little bit later if I don't already address them in the next part. Because what I want to do is talk a little bit about two of these three components, autonomy and firstly relatedness. I don't think we'll get to competence today, but I want to give you an example of how you would investigate these aspects of L2 second language motivation beyond the classroom. And I want to start with relatedness, because if you break it down, relatedness, as I said, is about, you know, whether people feel connected to others in their learning experience, right? How would you investigate that? How do you research relatedness? It may sound perhaps difficult, but actually, as teachers, we kind of do this all the time in an informal way. We always, hopefully, if you're a good teacher, try to establish from our learners how they are doing. And we do that in lots of ways. You know, we check body language, we check to see whether people are actively participating, whether people are giving responses, whether they show up late for class, whether they don't show up at all. You know, so we're constantly we have this sixth sense, you know, we as teachers, we have this radar that tells us the level of warmth and goodwill and the quality of the relationships in a classroom. So how do you then investigate that a little bit more formally? You know, essentially, how do you answer the question behind me here? How are you doing? And I want to share with you one set of techniques that are pedagogically very useful, especially in online teaching, but also very helpful for research, and I think not employed, not used as often as they could be. And this technique is called back-channeling. And back-channeling is essentially giving your learners additional communication channels, different ways of communicating things to you and to each other. Things like how they're doing, how they're feeling, whether they have questions, whether they have comments, etc. In fact, we are using a very, very simple back channel at the moment here in Zoom. We have a chat window open, and if, for example, you know, there was a problem my audio is not coming through or whatever, you could let me know in that way. You could post questions there, you can answer my questions there. So we have another communication channel going on other than the verbal channel, right? Now this is a webinar, it's a little bit different from a language class. Hopefully your language classes are more interactive than an online lecture, an online webinar like this. But usually in most formal traditional classrooms, if you think about it, there is a lot of pressure on learners to raise questions or to communicate. In most classes, the majority of the time, it's the teacher who does all of the talking. And I've investigated this in my own studies in the past. You know, the amount of teacher talk is very large. And we also know that the more teacher talk, especially in language education, the lower the language learning outcomes. So there is a relationship between these two. So you really want to find opportunities for learners to have a voice. Essentially, that's, if you want to describe it in one term, giving your learners a voice. Now, the voice that they normally have in class is limited because usually learners don't feel emboldened to speak up, right? They don't want to interrupt the teacher. And most, you know, in research that you read about, this is very clear. Learners feel a huge amount of pressure, anxiety even, about stopping the teacher and saying things like, I don't understand what you just said. Can you say that again, right? And unless you're a very good teacher, it's quite possible for a lot of learners, sometimes even the majority of the learners, not to know what you're doing or what you're saying. And for you as a teacher, not to know that your learners don't understand what's going on. Because a lot of teachers, you know, we say things like, okay, everybody understand? Everybody happy? Any questions? No? Okay, let's move on. You know, and within 5 seconds, you're already on to the next topic. So you have to be a very brave, very confident, and also actually, linguistically speaking, a quite strong student to be able to say, no, excuse me, teacher, I don't understand, could you, etc. Now, if you have a back channel, like for example a chat window or any of the type of apps that you see at the bottom of the screen, like Padlet or YoTeach, or it doesn't matter which one, they're all the same. You know, they all have some benefits and some drawbacks. It doesn't matter which one you use. But if you have another back channel available, then a student can type in a question without interrupting you. And if you're a good teacher and you're keeping an eye on the chat window there, and I can say, hey, you know, there's a few people who are asking me about this topic, and you go back and you explain it again. As a teacher, I have more information now about what's happening in my class, right? I have more potential to figure out how learners are feeling, whether they're understanding what I'm saying, whether they want me to slow down, whether they want me to speed up, etc. But also as a learner, I don't have to be so scared about asking a question or making a comment. And I can see others in the chat window are having the same problem as I'm having, so I'm not stupid. It's just that we're all not really getting it, right? So suddenly, that's very empowering, right? I feel a lot more connected. Basically, in the literature, this is referred to as you know, how normally in class we have what is called a vertical communication channel from top to bottom, right? From teacher to learner. Sometimes from learner to teacher, but mostly from teacher to learner. Back channels allow for what is called horizontal communication. So from learner to learner, or from learner to teacher, etc. It's in all possible directions. And often you will see that a learner poses a question and another learner has already answered it before the teacher even has read the question. So this is very powerful and very helpful because it increases the amount of interaction in class and the level of confidence of the students. From a research point of view, this is a really interesting set of data that you can generate. Because if you think about it, if you're using a back channel like any of the apps behind me on the screen, or any other ones for that matter, all of that data, everything that the learners post, everything that you post, including the timestamps of when things were posted, how long it took for somebody to reply, how long it took for the teacher to reply, etc. All of that is recorded automatically. You don't even have to do anything. You don't even have to do data collection. The data is collected for you. So once your lesson is over, well, you have this transcript of what was recorded in the back channel. And you can analyze that for all sorts of interesting questions. Who participated in the class? Who asked questions? Who were the students who didn't ask questions? What types of students consistently don't ask questions? What kinds of questions do students ask? What kinds of problems do they have with my class? Right? And dozens of other potential areas of interest that you might have. So a really powerful way of enhancing your classroom pedagogically, but at the same time collecting data. Now, if you're using quizzes, like Padlet quizzes, or any of the other apps that you have, you can enhance that even further. You can, for example, give your learners a quick quiz at the end of each explanation, or at the end of each new grammar point that you've introduced, or what have you. And that data, of course, is also recorded. Now, if you do that over a period of, say, a semester, and you print that out, or you look at the screen afterwards, you can see all sorts of interesting patterns. Like, hey, this chunk of content at the beginning of the course was probably too difficult because, look, their performance was really quite low. Or, when I started using this new teaching method in the second semester, or this new teaching approach or whatever, the number of problems went down, or the number of correct answers that students gave went up. So you have this almost real-time insight into your community in a way that is very difficult to achieve if you are just using the physical space in the classroom. So I just wanted to share that with you as an interesting pedagogical as well as research possibility. By the way, something that I don't want to spend too much time on, but I'll just briefly mention it. When we're talking about relatedness, and I think all of us will immediately, recognize the importance of that. How do you build that, right? Back channels is a good way to do that. But here's another one, storytelling, especially digital storytelling. I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of digital storytelling, but of course, all of us know the power of stories. That's how we grow up. As kids, as babies, the first instruction, if you will, that we receive is through stories. The stories that our parents tell us are the first way that we learn about the world, about our culture, about who we are. And as we get older, the stories become fewer and fewer. But actually, stories are still one of the most powerful ways of sharing ideas and sharing knowledge. Now, telling stories as a teacher is powerful. Inviting stories from your learners is even more powerful. Because now, as a learner, I can sense, I can feel that you as a teacher want to hear from me. You want to know my story. You have an interest in me. You care about me. And inviting stories in that sense is incredibly enhancing of the level of relatedness that we have. Now, when I say digital stories, I just briefly want to give you an example. Animaker or Powtoon or any of the other apps that are out there. And the reason why these are very helpful with language learners is that, firstly, they allow you to create a story not just using words or written or spoken words. And if you're a beginning language learner, how are you going to tell a story in words? Because you don't have the words yet, right? It's going to be very limited what you can express. But with digital storytelling, you can craft a story using words, using images, using video, using music, using sounds, using anime, using cartoons, etc. And these kinds of applications like Animaker and Powtoon and what have you allow you to combine all these different sources. So now suddenly, as a learner, I can actually express myself in a much more rich and interesting way than if I have to use words only. Remember that Richard Ryan on that triangle that I showed you earlier, the three components, autonomy, relatedness, and competence? And there were two authors at the bottom. I don't know if you noticed, but there were Ryan and DC. Ryan, his first name is Richard. Professor Richard Ryan is a phenomenal and very, very famous educational psychologist, as you can imagine, having come up with this model. One of the big names in the field of educational psych. He was at a conference that I was at a few years ago, and I got to speak to him. And he said, out of all the research that I've done over the decades, and all the hundreds of papers that I've written, if I really had to kind of come up with one simple question to investigate whether a particular school or classroom or university or group is likely to be academically successful as it can be, or not, He said, I would simply ask learners to agree or disagree with the following statement. My teacher cares about me. If the majority of the students say yes, my teacher cares about me, she looks after me, she likes me, she cares about me, then it's much more likely to be a successful community. If the majority of students say I don't know, or no, or I'm not sure, then it's not going to be successful. That is how powerful this component of teaching is. Now, how does a learner know that you care about them? Especially, how does a learner know that you care about them if you are in an online environment where the normal human warm interaction is much more difficult to convey? Well, asking people to share their stories with you is a good starting point. Listening to them is a good starting point. Giving them a voice through back channels or whatever other way is a good starting point, right? That shows the learner that you as a teacher, as a researcher, you actually want to hear from them. So I just wanted to briefly share that with you. In the final part, I want to focus on one of the most relevant components of learning beyond the classroom in terms of self-determination theory, and that is the notion of autonomy. As you can imagine, in learning beyond the classroom, learners increasingly need to be able to manage their own language learning, and into the future also manage their own learning without your help. So we're working towards not just teaching the language, but we're also teaching learners how to learn the language by themselves. So not just learning language, but also learning to learn the language. Two equally important components of successful teaching. So when we look at the literature on self-determination theory as it relates to autonomy, here's an interesting thing. If you investigate learning environments, and if you try to establish whether or not a particular environment, like a classroom or an online class, or it doesn't matter, whether that environment leads to an increased sense of autonomy, this is referred to as autonomy support, whether the environment offers autonomy support or not, you find that there are things that teachers and materials designers and curriculum developers can do that are more likely to lead to enhanced autonomy. And I'm not going to go through all of these. Again, you will have the PowerPoint later. But for example, giving learners a choice, meaningful choices over what to do, has been very clearly through research identified as enhancing learners' level of autonomy. If your classroom, or if the course that a learner is on basically removes all choice from the learners, it is very unlikely that learners will experience a sense of autonomy. Now, there's all sorts of interesting questions, research questions around this. What types of choices are best? What types of choices lead to a greater sense of autonomy than others? What types of choices are possible? Many of us are teaching in environments where we have to use a prescribed textbook, where we're teaching on a curriculum that was designed by someone else. There may not be a lot of freedom on the part of you as an individual teacher, but there are still things you can do. So what types of choices are possible in a particular environment? We don't really know. Nobody's really investigating these things, even though we know from decades of research how important a characteristic like having meaningful choices is to learners developing autonomy. And we also know that if learners don't develop autonomy, they don't develop motivation. And if they don't develop motivation, they're not going to learn as much. So it can't be clearer how important these aspects of learning are, yet we don't investigate them. I'll give you one more example, and the rest you can read yourself. There's more behind me here that you can't read now, but they'll be on the PowerPoint. Giving learners a clear rationale. Now here's one that I really like, because even if you are the kind of teacher who works in an environment where you don't have a lot of individual choice as a teacher, and you have to kind of use the prescribed textbook, you can still talk to your learners about why the content, the course, the materials, the activities are the way they are. Talking to your learners as individuals, talking to your learners from a point of view of seeing them as autonomous human beings. And people want to know what is going on. People want to know what is happening to them. People want to understand their environment. Well, if you as a teacher can explain, if you can communicate to your learners why you're doing a particular activity, what the benefit is, what the purpose is, etc., then learners are more likely to experience a sense of being included and of having a sense of control over their environment. So even in a very restrictive school or a class, you can still build, you can still include characteristics that are more likely to lead to autonomy. Research question. In a particular group, maybe in your class, what level of autonomy do learners report having? What aspects of the class are more likely or less likely to lead to your students reporting higher levels of autonomy? Fascinating research, pedagogically meaningful, very few people are doing it. Related to this, by the way, is of course the opposite type of research. Not investigating what helps autonomy, but what hinders autonomy, and this is referred to in the literature as autonomy frustration. What are the things that we know from research lead to learners not feeling in charge of their learning? Well, environments that are controlling, manipulative, intrusive, nagging, inflexible. These are things that we know not only do not work, they actually work negatively. If you think about, for example, a digital, an electronic, an online learning environment, one that is constantly nagging you to do things and is constantly pop-up things on the screen and it tells you exactly what to do and when and where, and you can't get out of the menu, well, you can already feel the sense of frustration in your body, even just hearing about that. And experiencing it as a learner is going to definitely lead to a loss of autonomy. So we know some of these characteristics, but the interesting point I want to make here is that most of what we know, not all of it, but most of what we know doesn't come from language education research. Most of what we know comes from other fields of educational research, mathematics or engineering or other fields, educational psychology, etc. We need to actually apply these skills, this knowledge, these questions to our own field. I'm just going to skip forward a couple of slides because I want to leave plenty of time for questions and a bit of a discussion. So the final thing I want to share with you is this. And it goes to the heart of learning beyond the classroom and different learning spaces. And I'll take you through this framework in a moment. But before I do, when we talk about learning beyond the classroom, autonomy, etc., all of that assumes, depends on our learners having some level of ability to make use of and benefit from whatever learning spaces that they are in. Let me clarify. If I'm a learner in your class and you're a good teacher, then I will benefit from your instruction because you're constantly helping me along. You're telling me what to do, you're giving me the best possible activities, you're giving me good feedback. Basically, all I need to do is follow along with you, concentrate, and do my best, and I will be fine. If I am playing computer games or listening to music or watching movies or talking to my friends online or engaging in any other type of learning space, you are not there. And I need to basically manage or direct my own learning in order to be able to benefit from the potential for learning that exists in that learning space. In other words, I need certain skills to be able to be successful. Those skills together are referred to as self-directed learning skills. And about 10 years ago, I designed this framework, which has been used in a number of studies over the years, that breaks down what these skills are in this sort of cycle. And I'll talk you through these in a little bit of detail. We're going to start at 9 o'clock on this model. And at 9 o'clock, you will see identifying learning needs. So the first thing that a learner needs to do when they engage in any form of self-directed learning is that they need to know what it is that they need to learn. Now, if you think about it, most learners, most of the time, have somebody else telling them what they need to do. Because it's a teacher in primary school, secondary school, it's a university lecturer that tells them, you need English for this purpose, this is what you need. Here's a test, this is how you did, this is what you need to improve, etc. So, as you can imagine, that doesn't really help learners' level of autonomy. But also, if we know that 70 to 80% of adult learning takes place outside the classroom, it makes it all the more important that we as teachers show our learners over time, gradually, how they can develop the skills to figure out for themselves what it is that they need about the language. And I'll give you a little example. I was talking to a chap, a guy who I was at the time working in at the University of Auckland in New Zealand, and I managed a self-access center, an independent learning center. And we had this guy, and he came in every day at 9 o'clock as soon as we opened, every single day. And he would come in and he would greet us very politely, and then he would go and he would get this massive grammar book called Practical English Usage by Michael Swan. I don't know if you know the book, but it's 800 pages. It's massive. You know, it's basically an alphabetical encyclopedia of all the grammatical features of the English language. And he would take this 800-page book and he would sit down with it and he would start, studying. And after a few days, and he would do that for 1 hour non-stop, and then at 10 o'clock he would leave every day. So after a few days, after a week, I went up to him. I said, gosh, what are you doing? You're working so hard. You come here every day. He said, well, I'm copying every page of this book in my own handwriting into my notepad. I said, you're copying the Encyclopedia of English Grammar? He said, yes. I said, okay. Why are you doing that? Hold on, let me ask you a question. Why are you learning English? He said, well, I've just moved to New Zealand and I want to be able to communicate with Kiwis. I want to be able to have conversations with local people from New Zealand because I want to make friends. So this to me was a very, very good example of someone with high motivation and very, very laudable learning habits doing the completely wrong thing for the completely wrong purpose at the time. His goal, his need, having just arrived from another country, was to speak, have a conversation, make friends, feel at home. And the method that he used was to focus on writing and reading and grammar. No one had ever told him, shown him, asked him even why he needed the language and how he could match what he would do to improve the language with his specific needs. So I told him, I said, congratulations, I've just saved you a lot of time. Forget about writing and reading. Half of the English language you don't need right now. You just focus on speaking and listening. And so your job has just become 50% easier. And then we started talking about how he could do that, right? So identifying learning needs, step number 1. Step number 2, setting goals. Learners don't know how to set goals about their language learning because teachers always do it for them. This week we're going to finish Unit 5. Next month you're going to take test number C. Next year you're going to take course whatever. Somebody else always sets your goals for you. But that doesn't help you in the real world. That doesn't help you in your lifelong and life-wide learning. So how do you set good goals? Well, we as teachers have a pretty good idea about this, but we need to teach our learners how to, for example, set what are called SMART goals. Now, you may have heard of this acronym before, SMART goals, S-M-A-R-T. Now, this stands for goals that are specific, because goals that are too vague are not helpful. M stands for measurable. Your goals have to be able to be measured. You need to know if you are achieving your goals. If you can't measure it, it doesn't help. A, it has to be attainable. It has to be possible. If a student comes to you and says, I want to get an IELTS score of 8 in the next 2 weeks, it's not a smart goal because it's not attainable. R, it has to be relevant. The example I just gave you of this learner wanting to improve conversation skills and copying the English grammar book was not relevant. And T, goals have to be time bound. You can't just say, I will improve my English. When? What aspect of your English? Right? I will achieve, B1 by the end of this year. That's a time bound goal. So if goals are not SMART, smart, they're not going to be possible to achieve. But learners don't do this unless someone, you, helps them to do this. Planning your learning, making a good plan. I'm going to skip these 2 slides here. Selecting meaningful resources, knowing what is a good resource, what is a reliable, trustworthy, useful online resource, for example, and what is not. Choosing the right strategies, being a strategic learner, being more effective and efficient in your learning, practicing, and of course monitoring your own progress and assessing yourself. How do you know when you are studying today that you're actually learning something? Well, normally the answer would be because my teacher gave me a task to do and I completed it and I got 7 out of 10, so I did it well. But what if there is no teacher? What if you are in an informal learning environment outside the classroom? How can you monitor whether your speaking skills or your pronunciation skills or your whatever are improving? Again, learners need to be shown how they can self-assess, how they can peer assess, how they can give each other feedback, how they can use all sorts of techniques. Again, we need to do that explicitly to help our learners along. I was going to give you one more example. Yeah, I think we have a few minutes. I will do that because it's from Thailand, and I think it would therefore be quite useful, at least to those of you that are working in or studying in Thailand. So as you can see here on the slide behind me, this is a project that we carried out at Chulalongkorn University about 10 years ago or something like that. I was there as a visiting professor for a few months. And I was working there with some other researchers. And we had this big challenge at the time. We had engineering students who basically, just like the students I mentioned earlier at the other university, at Durakit Pandit University, reported very, very low levels of motivation. They basically had never felt in charge of their learning. Their autonomy level was very low. Most of the classes, they didn't really connect with their teachers. The classes were very large. That was probably part of the problem. So the relatedness level was very low. And honestly, they weren't doing very well. They weren't making a lot of progress. So their sense of competence was very low too. So you can imagine that it was a terrible combination of factors. And the project that we came up with, and I wanted to conclude my part of the webinar today by giving you this example, brings together these 3 elements, I think, quite neatly. And it uses something called augmented reality. For those of you who are not familiar, I'll just very briefly explain it before I tell you what the project was about. So augmented reality is essentially you're just using your cell phone, and you look through your cell phone camera and you point it at the real world, and it could be a building, or it could be another person, or it could be a park or anything. And as you look through the phone's camera or your tablet, additional information about the thing that you are looking at is shown to you on your phone screen. So I might point my phone at the Grand Palace here in Bangkok, and as I'm looking at it, it will tell me on my screen Grand Palace, when it was built, and all sorts of information, etc. Okay? Now that is called augmented reality because I'm looking at reality, the physical world around us, but it's augmented or enhanced or improved, whatever you want to call it, in some way with digital information. Okay, so now we know about AR. So what happened with this project was that we scratched our brains and asked ourselves how we could make these learners feel, more motivated, essentially, to engage in English language learning. Now, as some of you may know, those of you who are in Thailand, Chulalongkorn, of course, is right in the center of Bangkok. It's an old university. It's a prestigious university. It gets a lot of visitors from around the world every year. Conference attendees, visiting professors. All sorts of events, etc. And it's a big campus, as you can see on the screen behind me. It's easy to get lost, and I myself got lost many times when I came there. And so the idea that we came up with was let's have our students design a tour, a virtual tour of this campus for future visitors. Meaning that if I, as a visiting professor, for example, arrive on the campus, I could walk around with my phone, point it at the library, and it would tell me, this is the library, it opens at 7 o'clock in the morning, but it would also give me other information relevant to me as an international visitor. So it might say, if you're an international visitor and you want to get an access card for the library, you need to go to level 3 and talk to Ajahn blah 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 to get your password, etc. Right? And similarly, not just academic facilities, but also social facilities like the canteen and the sports club, etc. I could walk around and get all the information. Now, this is what happened. We told our students that if they did a good job, the university had agreed that they would put this augmented reality tour as an app on the university website for visitors. Now, this changed things a lot because suddenly the stakes were high, meaning it was really important that these students produce a good product, because who wants to design a product for visitors that makes the university look bad or makes yourself look bad, right? So, of course, in the first class, we gave them instructions. We talked about, what is a tour? What kind of language do you need to use in a tour? A tour has to be clear. It has to be explicit. It can't be too detailed, etc. We talked about the linguistic features of a tour, right? And we gave them some examples, and we gave them some activities in the first 2 or 3 classes, trying to figure out what makes for a good text, what makes for a good tour, and what are some of the textual features that you need to include. And then, once we had done that, we said, okay, off you go out of the class into groups of 5, and you go and collect whatever information that you think you need to get to put into your group's tours. And we had one group looking at social facilities and another group looking at academic facilities. Now, this was very interesting, because what happened was, the students, as soon as they got up from their desks, they got excited. And we realized later, after having done some interviews with them and observing them, part of it was to do with the fact that they were no longer asked to sit still behind a desk the whole time. They were able to literally walk around and use their physical bodies, their physical selves, to move around and walk around the campus and talk to people and see things and chat to each other and buy an ice cream or whatever it was. It was suddenly a physical activity. And there's actually a really interesting theoretical concept which is very important in learning beyond the classroom, which is embodied cognition. Embodied, of course, meaning our physical body. Embodied cognition, of course, meaning learning and processing of data. And it points to the fact that when we learn, when we process information, we don't just do that with our brains. We process information with our bodies the whole day, the whole time. But in class, we have to turn that off. We have to sit still with our computer or a desk, and we're not allowed to move. It basically removes a big part of how we as humans learn. In this activity, it was out of class, it was physical, and it resulted in embodied cognition. More importantly, perhaps, these students did a fantastic job. They really went out of their way to interview staff, take photos, record audio, and put all of these multimedia, kind of like a digital story, into the virtual application. And they checked and double-checked everything for accuracy and linguistic accuracy and grammar mistakes, because they were personally motivated. They were experiencing a sense of relatedness to each other and to their future visitors. They were experiencing a sense of autonomy, the fact that they were able to make some choices themselves, and they were doing something that actually had a real life purpose and meaning. They were motivated because they wanted to do a great job. So I thought that was a nice way of kind of giving you an example of how you can design a project that is potentially pedagogically useful. I mean, we didn't know beforehand, it could have panned out very differently, but also interesting from a research point of view, because in this case the research took place outside the classroom, and we wanted to investigate what opportunities, what benefits that space outside of the classroom might have for learners, and what benefits they would be. In this case, it was motivation and embodied cognition. So I hope to have shown you that this kind of notion of thinking about the world beyond the classroom is so rich, so powerful, so important, and has so many questions begging to be investigated by researchers like you, relatively few of which are being investigated. So not only is it pedagogically and theoretically important, it is also at a practical level not a bad choice, because you're not competing with a lot of other people. There's a lot of need and few people doing this. So to conclude, my final slide, pedagogically and in terms of research, what I'm hoping to see in the future is that we bring much more closely together the two worlds that have for far too long been far too far apart, and that is the world of learning and the world of learners' personal lives. And if we can combine these pedagogically and theoretically, we will all be all the better for it. And we need you to do that and investigate these kinds of topics. Now, as you can probably clearly tell, I'm very interested in this area. I have been for a long time. We will have some time for questions now. But if at some point in the future you have other questions, or if indeed you are thinking of doing some research and you want to have a conversation about that, don't hesitate to contact me. I always love hearing from you. I'm online. If you are in Thailand, you'll probably be using that. But you can also reach me in any of these other ways. Again, the link for the presentation for the digital handout, as well as the PowerPoints, is the same as before. So innovationandteaching.org/buriram.php. If you just go to innovationandteaching.org and click on publications, you'll find a lot of articles on topics like augmented reality and learning beyond the classroom. So if you want to read more, there's a lot of resources available there. I'll stop talking here. Let's open it up to some questions and discussion. And thank you so much for listening.
Now it is time for the Q&A session. So anyone can feel free to ask by the voice channel. If you are not sure about or uncomfortable to deliver via the voice channel, you can leave the message into the chat box.
You can use the back channel.
I think some of our friends from Myanmar, they have some question to ask the speakers. Please turn on your microphone and ask him directly. That'll be a good time for you to get the right answer from our guest speaker today.
Hello. First of all, I would like to give my special thanks for today, because as an English language teacher, moreover, I'm a Ph.D. student in first batch of English language teaching program at Buriram Rajabhat University, Thailand.
Where could you please introduce yourself? Where are you from?
Yes, my name is Yimo and I'm from Myanmar.
Great. Nice to meet you.
Yes, Mingalapa. Yes. So today I learned a lot from you concerning what innovation concerning work research for English language teaching. So I want to know about some of the techniques and innovation methods for English language teacher, because according to my background knowledge and my current experiences in Myanmar, most of the learners they have little exposure in public speaking. I mean that we have been teaching traditional methods, and they can get enough knowledge for the exposure of the foreign language, speaking English. So in the classroom, when the teachers use, we have to use normally bilingual language. I mean, we have to use mother tongue in the foreign language English, but some of the students are facing a lot of challenges because they don't dare to talk for the public speaking in the classroom or in the communication. So as a teacher, I want to know what are the innovative teaching methods for speaking in the classroom.
You raised some really good points, and it's similar in many other countries, what you are describing. And you asked both about the pedagogy and about research, and I think we have a lot of opportunities to use technology. I don't know whether your students are rural or whether they are in the city, whether they have access to technology, or at least whether they can share some technology between them. But if they do, if they can, then there are some real benefits to considering kind of conceptualizing, moving away from the idea of a classroom as this self-contained thing, and instead thinking of learning first. And the learning can happen, part of it will happen in the classroom, part of it will happen outside the classroom. And for you as a teacher to connect with your learners, not just when they are in this part that is called the classroom, but also to give them opportunities to practice and record and share their language, including their speaking, when they're not necessarily in your class face to face. And let me give you a practical example of what I mean. There are apps, including some that are free, like VoiceThread. I don't know if you're familiar with VoiceThread, but there are hundreds like them, and they allow users to post short recordings of their voice on a forum, essentially, right? And so anyone in a group, like anyone in your class, can see and listen to these voice recordings, but it's done asynchronously, so meaning it's not done at the same time. We don't have to do it live. You can record your voice today, I can listen to it tonight, I can respond to it tomorrow, and you can hear my response to your post, etc. As a teacher, I can listen to the posts that my learners have made, the recordings that they've made, and I can respond to those as well. Plus, when it's time for our physical class, I can then, because I've already listened to all of your recordings and your asynchronous conversations, I already have some idea of the kinds of topics that you talked about, some of the problems that you might have had, whether it's pronunciation or whether it's some other aspect of speaking skills. So now I have a better idea of what to focus on in class. All of this information, all of this data, of course, is also recorded electronically, because it's recorded on a tablet or a phone or a computer, and it's recorded there by default. So that means that now, as a researcher, at the end of the week, at the end of the course, whenever, I can download all those recordings and I can investigate all sorts of things, like how many of my students posted messages, how many messages did they post, how long were those messages, what types of instructions of mine resulted in more or longer posts from students, and what types of instructions of mine resulted in lower or fewer posts from my students. So you can investigate things like willingness to communicate, or L2 motivation, or speaking confidence, etc. So my point is, by moving away from the idea of having to do everything in class, which puts a lot of pressure on you as a teacher and a lot of pressure on your students, especially when it comes to speaking, and instead thinking of opportunities that go beyond and in between classes, there is a lot of benefit to be gained from using new technologies that open up the space. I hope that sort of answered your question. Feel free to email me or contact me afterwards if you want to talk about this more, but it's a really good point. I think we had a question from Lolita.
And also into the chat box,
Yeah, thank
Professor.
you. Thank
Yes.
you.
She said as you have mainly talked about relatedness and autonomy for mastery learning, could you elaborate some ideas of the competence or the competencies left in L2 motivation?
Yes, sure. Learners, we as humans need to feel that we are getting better at what we're doing. If we're investing time in something, we need to have a sense of progress. We need to feel that we are capable of growing. If we don't have that sense, our motivation is reduced or eliminated entirely. So the question then becomes, as a teacher, how can you give learners a sense of growth? And one way of doing that is to make their progress visible, to make it clear to them, to make it clear to them what they have done and what result that has had on their language proficiency. So we know from research that one way in which learners feel more competent is when their teachers give them a lot of feedback. And especially if that feedback is constructive. Not all the feedback has to be positive, it's fine to point out things that need to be done and can be done better, but learners appreciate constructive feedback because it shows a path forward. It also shows where you have already improved. Now, again, by bringing in the space beyond the classroom and the space within the classroom, we can suddenly recognize learning that learners do when they're not inside our physical classroom. If we, for example, ask learners to keep a record, like an online diary or learning record of some sort, or a portfolio or what have you, of their language learning experiences and practices outside the classroom, maybe the movies that they've watched, the music that they've listened to, the games that they've played, the social media that they've used, whatever it may be, suddenly we as teachers have more insight into what our learners do, and the learners are more likely to get more feedback on everything that they've done rather than just the part there where we show up in class and carry out the activities that our teacher has asked us to do. There are a lot of good programs also that enable you as a teacher, even in class, to recognize different types of language learner contributions. Programs like Class Dojo, TESOL, Socrative, there's so many of them, allow you as a teacher in a physical or online class to, for example, give learners, to recognize when learners are maybe being particularly helpful in class, or when they're being very good at collaborating, or when they are willing to take a risk, or when they're speaking more. And you can give learners points or stickers, or depending on their age, whatever is most appropriate. You can recognize, you can let your students know that, hey, I see what you're doing and you're becoming better, even if not just at the level of language. Maybe even you didn't do so well on this particular activity in terms of your language output, but you tried really hard and I can see that, or you were really collaborating very well with your classmates. And by acknowledging that, as a learner, I feel that you as a teacher, you see me, you relate to me, and I can feel a sense of competence. So again, just broaden your minds, moving away from the shackles of the classroom, and looking at your learners in terms of all the different learning and the different spaces that they occupy, suddenly gives you so many more opportunities to connect with them. It's eye-opening and incredibly powerful. I think we had a question from Lolita earlier.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe it's not more on a question, or I have a question maybe at the middle of my reaction, but as a simple thank you very much for challenging everybody, because your talk is actually it laid a much challenge, especially for me as a social science major, because of we need to really change our mentality about doing research. That doing research is not only for publishing an article or getting a promotion, but we need to realize as teachers, as lecturers, that we need to do research in order for us to become a part of the solution of any problem that we are to see in and out of our classroom. But the thing there is, what I observe is the teachers or the lecturers or whoever researchers are, they are actually doing research specifically on qualitative, wherein after they find out or after the result of the research, they have these figures, they have these recommendations, they publish an article, but they stop there. That we need to realize as teachers and lecturers that we should not stop there. So my reaction is, teachers of today or lecturers of today are actually engaged more on qualitative research. I will go back to your talk a while back that reflect on our values, reflect on your values, wherein when we are to do quantitative research, we are really to put on our values into our research, into our output. If you want change, if you want to be part of the solution, if you want to contribute in a body of knowledge. But again, the researchers are more engaged in quality than in quantity, because of in quantitative research, it takes time, it takes money, it takes a lot of effort, but that is what we need. So maybe as I am going through digesting all of your messages in your talk, it's actually time to encourage the lecturers and the teachers or researchers to engage more in quantity. And maybe we need more encouragement or tips from you as an experienced researcher on how can we, or maybe mix together quali and quanti. So if you can share some tips to us or encourage us further to engage more on this type of researches. So thank you very much.
Sure, yeah, and you're right. You know, a lot of teachers are a little bit daunted, a little bit afraid of quantitative research because they think it's statistics and maybe will take a long time and involve a lot of people and we need a lot of funding, etc. And this is an interesting point about a lot of the digital tools, not exclusively, but a lot of the technologies that we've looked at today. They do actually allow us to investigate a lot of what happens in our classes and beyond quantitatively, because of the fact that you don't need to go out and collect additional or explicit special data. A lot of what you are doing automatically already generates a lot of data. If you're, for example, you're using a learning management system in your university or your school, whether it's Moodle or Blackboard or something like that, have another look at it and see how incredibly much data that type of environment already records about who your students are, how often they log in, how long they log in for, whether they submit their assignments on time, how they did, how your class did compared to my colleague's class, how my colleague's class did this year compared to how they did last. I mean, the number of potential questions that you could ask and answer with the amount of data that is already recorded automatically before you even start using any of the applications that we looked at today is huge. And as long as you start from a value-driven set of questions, as long as you start from your pedagogy, so don't start from the data, but start from pedagogical questions, like I want to know why some of my students drop out after the first semester. Why did they leave? Who are they? Well, log into your learning management system and you might find out that it's mostly girls or mostly boys or mostly students from whatever. So my answer to your question is actually most of what we need is already there. We just need to open our eyes more and look at it more broadly. In the chat window, there was a question about flexible learning, and especially in regards to slower learners. And I think that's a really important point. If you are teaching classes that have a lot of mixed ability, MACs, mixed ability classrooms, where you have students of different levels, it can be really, really tricky, right? Because if you cover the same ground multiple times to help slower learners catch up, well, other learners are going to be bored, and that's not going to help their level of motivation. And vice versa, if you just skip the content, then the slower learners are going to be demotivated because they don't understand what you're saying. And this is another example of where back channels, not to go over the same thing again, but where technologies like back channels can be so powerful, because you can invite your learners, using a very, very simple quiz. Whenever you finish in your teaching, whenever you finish a particular small unit of content, sometimes it's 10 minutes, sometimes it's half an hour, whatever, you just post a quick quiz and say, on a scale of 1 to 5, how confident do you feel now that you understand this topic that we just discussed? All right, and the students, all they need to do is type 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, okay? And you don't do anything with that immediately in class, unless you have time, but in many cases you won't. But after the class, you look at that data and you say, hey, hold on, out of the 40 students in my class, there were 4 who rated topics 3 and 4 really low. Well, I don't need to talk about all of that again in the next class, because out of 40 students, there were only 3 or 4 who needed some extra support. I'm going to follow up, and I'm going to reach out to these students, maybe send them an email, or through the LMS, send them some extra practice materials, right? So it allows you to be a lot more efficient with your time. It allows you to monitor what students are doing by simply inviting them to let you know how they are doing. And that increases the flexibility that you asked about in the chat window a lot as well.
Okay, that's okay, Professor, because we are
We're over time. Yes, I see. Yeah.
Yes. So I told everybody to deliver their own question to your contact, especially for the email and the Twitter. So this would be has come to the end of the webinar. So I would like to invite Associate Professor Dr. Akrapol Nermaihom, Dean of Faculty of Humanities and Social Science, Rajabhat University, Rajabhat Buriram University, to deliver the closing remark. So
before ending our webinar, on behalf of BRU, the HUSOC faculty, M.Ed ELT program, and also Ph.D. ELT program, I would like to thank you very so much, our academic partners from different universities. We are very honored today to have Professor Andrew from Suranari University Technology with us. We are very honored in this. He's a very well-known linguistic scholar. Thank you so much for coming to join our webinar today, sir. And also we have our academic friends from Nakhon Ratchasima Rajabhat University. Thank you so much. From Khon Kaen University, from Mosawat Srinakharinthra Virod Prasan Mit University, from Mahajulat Chiang Mai University. Thank you so much, my colleagues, Lolita and Rube from Iran, and Smith from Cameroon, my Surin from Myanmar. Thank you so much for your energetic participation in this webinar. I can see that you are interested in this webinar because you raised a lot of questions, but unfortunately we are running out of time. But I think it is good, because if you let the professor answer everything, I don't know next time what is he going to tell you. So that's why I keep something as secret. All right, we are going to have Professor Renders with us, maybe on site or on site at our BU campus or online. We highly hope to have his academic support once again. So at this auspicious moment, I would like once again ask all of you, please join me in giving him a big round of applause for his great speech and insightful talk today. Thank you so
ขอบคุณ
much.
ครับ
Thank you so much. And at this auspicious moment, please allow me to declare the webinar officially closed. Thank you so much. Stay healthy and be safe from COVID-19. See you next time. Thank you very so much. ขอบคุณและสวัสดีครับ
Bye everybody.
Thank you
Thank you.
everyone.
ขอบคุณครับ Thank you so much.